For as long as the personal computer has been in existence as a mainstay in people's homes, there have been examples of educational software to go along with them, with one of the most famous being the Typing Tutor. Well, over in the United States, the Typing Tutor would arise along with large software companies, starting with Microsoft's Typing Tutor and continuing on with programs like MasterType. The way things went about in Japan was a little different. And over the last 40 years, the games in that genre have shifted and morphed as the way that people lived and worked with computers changed. It's not just a story of the software itself. It's also a story of the environment that these games came from. Starting with an organization founded by students that established a standard for type-in programs, with one of its members having a reputation mysterious enough that internet debates continue as to whether or not she actually existed, to an idiosyncratic creator from a publishing company who pushed the medium forward with an experimental game that felt decades ahead of its time, and continuing with both large companies and independent creators from the age of shareware, using limited resources to create titles which resonated with audiences, including an extremely clever college student whose surprise hit would exemplify late 90s internet experimentation, and ending with an extremely popular edutainment game, a conversion of an arcade classic, and many simultaneously developed titles would cause the market to oversaturate and eventually break. Throughout all of this, the creators and their work tell not just the story of the games themselves, but of computing in Japan as a whole over the last 40 years. And it all starts around 1982, as machines like the Fujitsu FM7 were beginning to take hold in the market. Back in the first half of the 1980s, before CD-ROMs and before cheap hard drive storage, one of the most common ways for computer users to get programs for their personal use was to buy magazines and type the programs within them themselves. And in Japan, this was a surprisingly big business. Tied to large publishing houses, magazines like Login, MyCom Basic, and many others would post hundreds of pages of code in their issues, written in the at the time easier to understand computer language of BASIC. These programs could be all sorts of things, sometimes utilities, sometimes games, and sometimes things like art illustrations or pieces of music from popular media at the time. A lot of times, the type-in games in the books ended up being clones or variations on popular software at the time. The explosion of what was called type-in games across all of these periodicals gave rise to some issues on the user side of things. In order for these programs to work properly, they had to be a certain quality. They had to be legible, and typos would have to be minimized so that future corrections in magazines would not have to be run. In the interest of solving these problems, groups interested in standardization would begin to form naturally, and one of the main sources for groups like this were computer clubs in colleges and high schools. One of the most prominent during that time was Foresight Planning, a group of students bound together by their philosophy that anyone could program given that the instructions were clear enough. Foresight Planning would end up being prolific, and in pursuit of this philosophy, they released a lot of information across various forms of media throughout the 1980s, including an on and off newsletter, as well as a cassette tape of various programs and games that came along as a pack-in with some of their issues. One of their members even ran a BBS, a kind of prototypical pre-internet community you could reach with a modem, called Foresight Bulletin Information System, and known colloquially as FBI. As the members of Foresight Planning submitted their work to the programming sections of magazines, a small fandom of sorts began to form around them. One of the most popular members of this group was Harumi Takahashi. Harumi Takahashi claimed to be a high school student that had designed a huge number of programs in just several weeks, and her work stands out among her peers, writing clear-to-understand code around a more informal and personal narrative. Her work was popular enough that it would eventually go on to be sold in book collections. However, debate still exists on the internet as to whether or not Harumi Takahashi actually existed as a person, instead theorizing that it could have been a pseudonym for Foresight Planning itself, that it could have been a pseudonym for one of the creators in the group, or maybe even a pen name for Takahisa Mori, another member of Foresight that still creates textbooks to this day, and actually made a tribute game for Harumi Takahashi called Stop Harumi-chan, which was published in multiple magazines. In an excellent interview with Akiba PC Hotline, the prolific creator denied the connection, stating that Harumi was represented by a company and was highly private. They did have a professional working relationship, though, with both influencing the other on how to write code, as well as collaborating on one of the Harumi Takahashi programming books. He explains,
"Before I wrote the book, the usual way of writing programs was to list everything, and I didn't have the awareness to make it easy to read. However, when I looked at Harumi's game library and similar books, I admired how making it easy to read actually makes it easier to create, and the meaning easier to understand. I was impressed by that. At the time, there was no structured programming, so it was a trial and error period of figuring out what makes something easy to read, efficient, or easy to create. One of the things I imitated was that. But we didn't meet. There was Natsume Publishing in between us, and I received her letters through them. And when I replied, it went to the publisher with a letter, sent back to the other party through the company. There was no direct letter exchange, and it was done through the person in charge. Once, I was given a Sanrio character called Tuxedo Sam as a present. I was so happy when I got this that I used it for gaming, so in my mind, she really existed."
The earliest typing simulator found while researching this was Typing Lesson, and it comes from one of the Harumi Takahashi textbooks. From typing it out, it's easy to understand why Harumi's work was so popular. The code was so well written, in fact, that even though I hadn't touched BASIC since I was a child, I was able to understand and make a prototype of it here following her instructions, despite her comment code being in another language. Typing Lesson was a simple game of typing letters that appear on screen as fast as possible while a timer counts down. And it wouldn't be the only example of this sort of utility showing up in these sorts of magazines. As a matter of fact, Typing Tutors would end up becoming a popular type-in topic throughout the early 1980s, with games like Type Mogura, published in Micom Basic, and Nyan Nyan Type Commander, published in OFM magazine. For example, the game Beat the Karagon, published in Microcomputer, was a kind of do-it-yourself small variation of a game called Type Attack, which was itself a kind of variation clone of Space Invaders that was common across early Western PCs. But not everything came from bedroom coders, and releases from software houses both small and large would come out as well. Due to their rather obscure nature, a lot of these early professional releases remain undumped, although evidence of them still exists online in box art, screenshots, and prototypes. On the smaller side of things, we have Typing Vader for the MSX, developed by Policy, who do not appear to have credit in any other work. And it's a much more direct clone of Type Attack, almost to the point of being a copy. On the larger side of things, though, some surprisingly heavy hitters and growing studios would try their hand at this as well. Enix would get in on the act with Game D-Type, and there would also be an attempt at a typing tutor from Konami, with Keyboard Master for the MSX. Keyboard Master was a typing tutor software which, if it had actually come out, would have had a special speech cartridge packed along with it that would have had the ability to speak out commands on the screen as a bonus. This software ended up not being finished, but a prototype still exists online, as well as some attempts at cover art. Moving forward in time to the second half of the 1980s to the early 1990s, Typing Tutors would die down a bit. Enix would release ports of utilities and games for the Konica typing system for word processors under the name Lesson 98 1 and 2, as PC-98 ports. They would also make another suite specifically for schools called the Challenge the Touch Type series. Being that these were more tailored for businesses and schools than for home use, they are very straightforward and ended up rather dry. But there were two other titles for the now more common PC-98 being developed that would have much more of an impact. One of these would have an interesting backstory and become a standard used up even to this year. And the other would be a cult classic so unusual that it would leave a mark on everything that came after it. A popular program that was released as freeware was Mikatype, designed in 1991 by Jiro Imamura. Jiro Imamura is now a professor and educator, but before that he bounced around quite a few jobs in his earlier life. On his website, he explains what inspired the software's creation.
A while back, when I worked in research, I was to use the image recognition system I developed in a research laboratory at a chemical company in Osaka. The purpose was a regular DNA synthesis measurement. The person in charge of the experiment waiting for me in Osaka was a lovely young woman wearing a pink sweatshirt. Everyone in that laboratory was dressed in matching pink sweatshirts. On those sweatshirts, there was a word in English along with an illustration that meant, "We are mutants." After returning to Tokyo, I decided to name my created image recognition system Mika after her name. I named my typing software after her as well.
Mikatype would end up becoming popular in the early days of dial-up, and Jiro Imamura found that requests from schools to utilize his software came in rapidly. According to the last check on the creator's website, about 108 educational institutions across Japan are still using Mikatype in some capacity. Users can still download it to this day and it still works just fine, with the creator still maintaining his website and updating Mikatype and other Mika-themed software to work with modern operating systems. He has also vowed for all of the utilities in the Mika suite to remain free for individual download as long as he is alive. While Mikatype would end up with a wide adoption, there would be another major typing game in the first half of the 1990s that came from an unexpected source that had a tie-back to the games that started it all. Although ASCII would be mostly familiar to viewers of this channel as the publishing house behind Login magazine, they did also reach out into software development and distribution at times, and one of the programmers on the staff at ASCII was Michiaki Tsubaki. Michiaki Tsubaki only worked for ASCII for a couple of years, but during his short tenure he was responsible for several edutainment games, including the Insiders series, role-playing games meant to teach computer concepts like architecture and networking. Although edutainment games by their nature can end up very dry, Michiaki Tsubaki's games were not like that at all, and ended up very unique, with a surreal, dark, and almost frightening atmosphere that used an RPG framework to move forward with a highly unconventional presentation, locking off usual menu options and giving the player a chance to think on their feet and improvise. After creating the Insiders series, Michiaki Tsubaki would hone this strategy to a fine point and release a game that would become a cult classic, an RPG called The Sword of Kumdor, which combined the humor of something like Earthbound, the utility of a typing tutor, and the general framework of a game like Dragon Quest. This game has actually received 2 fan translations. One machine translated that wasn't quite as successful as its intention, and a much better one done by Lynn and playtested by Pasakhan Deacon that flows better, translates images and drawn text as well as the text in the game, and plays much more stably. That latter one will be the one that we're looking at here, and I'll link the translation in the description. Sword of Kumdor tells the story of a legendary typist, the male version of which bearing more than a passing resemblance to David Byrne's big suit costume, who, after traveling on their own, are recruited to save a kingdom on a distant planet, whose trees are turning to stone, and whose technology is breaking all over their world. The typist takes up the offer, but unfortunately, just as they are about to land, their ship crashes, destroying their experience, sending all the keys on their keyboard flying, and severely limiting the options and keys that the player can use. The player must then travel through this strange realm, picking up keys to restore them to their keyboard, learning special spell combos, and using their touch-type skills to solve puzzles, fight monsters in combat, and unlock barriers. Sword of Kumdor has a very unusual control scheme. Most actions outside of combat or typing practice are controlled only by the F, J, and spacebar keys, so that the player can keep their hands on home row at all times. Sword of Kumdor has a kind of humorous darkness about it that makes it age very well despite its odd controls. Fans of things like Undertale, Earthbound, or, as both playtester and translator have pointed out, even darker indie games like Space Funeral, will find a lot to like here. As a humorous story slowly gives way to a darker and more fourth wall-breaking one, as the player moves towards the highly difficult final area. An inexplicable force called the Dreamtime, which has corrupted a missing royal, and is breaking the reality of the world itself. Sword of Kumdor actually has multiple endings that are dependent on the words per minute of the user, giving the player an incentive to try again and again, getting better at typing while doing so. While there wasn't much contemporary coverage of the game, I couldn't even find any sales data for it. It has come to be regarded as a cult classic, and still comes up in discussion on Japanese message boards to this day. The translation is crisp and entertaining, and the game is well worth checking out. Typing games wouldn't get too much of a presence in the latter half of the 1990s, but towards the end of the millennium, similar programs from 3 different worlds would come out at about the same time, and once again bring life back into the genre. As shareware increased in popularity, and the online indie scene in Japan expanded onto websites like Vector, and technologies like Flash and Macromedia Director allowed for easier creation of simple games with multimedia components, Typing Tutors would again emerge, with games like Push to Sekoi, a simple typing game involving sumo wrestlers. The most prominent of these, though, would rise above its contemporaries, and even be featured in major magazines and adopted in schools. Created by a young programmer by the name of Yoshiyuki Higo, a student at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, Ozawa Ken was a fighting game with typing tutor elements named after the Ozawa Laboratory at the same university. Ozawa Ken has a simple, funny, and addictive premise. Type things correctly for offense and defense, and watch digitized characters with intentionally limited animation battle it out on screen. Despite the humorous presentation, it's surprisingly robust for what would look on the surface to be a joke game, with detailed statistics covering your performance. Ozawa Ken was popular enough that it ended up being used in schools, as well as getting coverage in lifestyle magazines, books, and even large newspapers like Asahi Shimbun. The game was so popular, in fact, that it even got a tie-in re-release with special guest characters, Ozawa Ken, Enter the Auntie, had comedian and Gakisuka guest star Chiyoko Asami appear as a boss. On the more corporate side of things, though, another company that was developing typing tutors was SourceNext, whom most people would be familiar with from their PC ports of games like Resident Evil and Dino Crisis. But the software that they developed extended far beyond ports, and one of their most surprising successes was a typing tutor edutainment game called Toku-Uchi Gunfight with Keyboard. This game was basically a minigame collection with an Old West theme, and it would sell so well that it would end up being one of their #1 sellers in software period, as well as winning multiple awards from educational institutions. Due to this success, it has been repackaged many times. It can still be bought pretty easily to this day. Last and most importantly, on the arcade front, a division within Sega's arcade branches called A1 was beginning to branch off into another subsidiary company called WoW Entertainment. And one of the first projects that team worked on was a conversion of one of their popular gun games, which had been getting a bit on in years and performing a bit less at game centers. According to a book on Sega's arcade history, in order to spice up the arcade machine's performance, they decided to change the interface, giving it a dual keyboard setup instead, as well as working with Smilebit, another group within Sega, on a home console port of this new conversion, which would also be used to sell the Dreamcast's new keyboard peripheral. These companies would enter the ring with one of the most famous typing tutors, a conversion of the House of the Dead 2, now known as the Typing of the Dead. Typing of the Dead was a surprising success at game centers. Never quite a #1 seller. Derby Owners Club had an amazing lock on that lasted for 2 years that nothing could touch. But consistently performing in the top 10, and outperforming consistently even the older House of the Dead arcade machines. Typing of the Dead would also be tied to Sega's promotional events, having a typing tournament held for local office ladies that was done at the Tokyo Game Show in April of 2000, and ended up getting coverage in Arcadia magazine. A cult audience would develop around these sorts of games as well, and from that, competition would be born. A way-backed blog from one of the competitors in typing goes over the scene in Tokyo quite extensively. The blog, which ran from the late 90s until about 2008, contains multiple stories of the author trying different scores at various game centers and the performances of other people big in that scene at the time, attempting similar things. And it also gives us some very interesting facts that go against common myths. Well, it's thought that the Typing of the Dead popularized things and clones of it came in its wake. Due to the popularity of Ozawa Ken and Toku-Uchi Gunfight with Keyboard, this isn't true. And in one of the April 2000 entries in the blog, the author tells the story of an arcade and store crawl that he and other people involved in the scene went on after witnessing the Office Lady competition. And in that, they tried out various software on sale or in preview across Akihabara, and offered various opinions on games and upcoming utilities from various companies. Typing of the Dead was successful enough to warrant a sequel based on House of the Dead 3, as well as all sorts of ports, including multiple PC ports, one for PC and Mac called The Typing of the Dead Lariat, which had the characters carrying Macs on their backs, a PlayStation 2 port that was also used to sell a keyboard peripheral, and an English tutor for the Nintendo DS. Sega's arcade division would also convert their arcade game Lupin III: The Shooting into a typing game as well, but it wouldn't play as successfully as Typing of the Dead, having to cut a great deal of content to accommodate the change in genre and still work properly on Sega's Naomi arcade hardware. These three factors, along with a new ruling in schools that allowed for things like computer learning to be more prominent, greatly opened the floodgates. And we would go from sparse releases in the typing genre to common ones, sometimes in very direct competition with each other. Hudson would respond to the popularity of these types of games with a parody of both typing games and dating sims a year later, with the Typing of the Date for the Dreamcast. And Konami themselves would also follow up in response to that, with multiple licensed typing games in the Tokimeki Memorial series, for both girls and boys' side. One of the best from this response was the game Tokimeki Memorial Typing 2, which, like Typing of the Date, was basically an extremely relatable stumbling over talking to women simulator. You pick one of the characters and type out your responses in real time, and they respond to you more positively the better you type. Konami would also create multiple ports of their music titles and change them into typing tutors. And for that, they would partner with Innis, Hands-On Entertainment, and Oracion. One of their more prolific conversions, and one of their strongest and well-selling titles, although the competitive typing community on the blog was not that fond of it, was Beatmania Da, a conversion of Konami's Beatmania arcade machines that had an exceptionally high difficulty. Konami would even use the same engine for this game to develop another arcade conversion, making one of their Poppin' Music arcade games into another typing tutor, but this time balancing the difficulty. Sega themselves would remain strong in this new genre, releasing a conversion of Space Harrier called, appropriately enough, Typing Space Harrier. And even Nihon Falcom would get in on the act with a hidden minigame in Zwei the Argus adventure called The Typing of Ease, which is basically a typing tutor parody of Ease 2. Throughout the first half of the 2000s, and due to the success of Tokuuchi Gunfight with Keyboard, Ozawa Ken, and the games mentioned, companies would take advantage of the ease of using Macromedia Flash and Director, and release an absolute deluge of licensed anime titles. SourceNext would capitalize on the success of Gunfight with Keyboard by releasing the Tokuuchi Heroes series, licensed typing games based on properties like Detective Conan and others. SourceNext had such frequency to these releases that they came out with 3 typing games based on space battleship Yamato over the course of a single year. Competitor SSI TriStar would also get into the multiple franchise act, with typing games based on Space Adventure Cobra, a typing game based on Ashita no Joe that would actually end up getting a PlayStation 2 port, 3 games based on Macross, and one particularly beloved series that we'll get to take a look at in a little bit. Sunrise would also work with Mediatype on multiple Gundam typing games as well. Of particular note was Gynex, who would start out by making a very rare and highly regarded typing tutor based on Gunbuster, and would also release a pair of Neon Genesis Evangelion typing games for the Dreamcast that occasionally chose some odd scenes to adapt. And it didn't stop there, with all sorts of other companies releasing even more clones. I was able to acquire one of these physically, so let's take a look at Lupin III Typing Soft 2, a completely separate game than Lupin III the Typing. Lupin III Typing Soft is nowhere near as good as the arcade game, and is a shovelware-ish title with simple mini-games interspersed with full-screen clips of episodes from the first 2 television shows. To its credit, though, it does mix between inputs of English and Japanese alphabets, making it a bit more challenging than some of the other games in this group. But unfortunately, as with this and a lot of other games, they were fundamentally cash-ins that hoped to lure students into learning how to be better typists with things like audio clips, wallpapers, and screensavers. The Yamato series in particular had very good CGI for the time, and that aspect would be popular enough that SourceNext would release a separate game consisting entirely of minigames and just those CGI files. Even though the average quality of these games was not good, some of them were quite a bit better than others. And while it's been stated multiple times over the internet that the Typing of the Dead was the only game to get a mature rating that was a typing tutor, that's actually not true. And one of the better licensed series to come from SSI TriStar would have a truly unusual instructor. Why have Mavis Beacon when you can have a typing tutor who can punch people so hard that they explode? Yes, it's Fist of the North Star typing. And the Hokuto no Ken Gekeuchi series would actually end up having 4 popular titles, and they do not skimp on the gore. Hilariously though, of all the titles I tried for this, the voiceover Kenshiro tutor actually ended up being the most instructional and useful by far, and the game itself actually feels pretty educationally sound. Having a wonderful kana library you can check on at any time, as well as making a good point in the voiceovers to watch out for things like pain in your fingers when reaching for the Y and U keys. No joke, Kenshiro was somehow the best of the tutors in all the software I looked at, and I can see why this series would end up becoming popular. Despite being absolutely drenched in blood, these games are very good for what they are. And the Fist of the North Star typing games would actually tone down the gore a bit as they got more and more popular, although adding on some additional features like some very, very good typing drills. This popularity reached its peak towards the middle of the 2000s, and there was even an online multiplayer battle game similar to Type Racer, for which servers shut down in 2006. As mentioned, though, not everything achieved the same level of success. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Typing Fighter 2, which despite being appealing on the surface, ends up remarkably terrible, which stings even more when you think about how good fighting tutor typing games like Ozawa Ken are. The game's clips are badly programmed together, the response time is horrific, and nothing works the way that it should. The game may even be worse than Street Fighter II's original DOS port. Because of this craze brought on by Tokauchi Gunfight with Keyboard, Typing of the Dead, Ozawa Ken, and all of these clones, typing games would peter out after this. There were simply too many things available and the market just crashed. But some of them can still be downloaded from the companies that produce them. And the Tokauchi series still has spin-offs that can be bought to this day. But the people that made them went on to do other things, and a lot of them now work in education. While we don't know the exact identity of Harumi Takahashi, Takahisa Mori, who was mistaken for her, went on to write programming textbooks and still does to this day, with the interview sourced for this video taking place only a couple of years ago. Yoshiyuki Higo, the creator of Ozawa Ken, went on to create many educational games, and still has an active blog that splits between LEGO creations and his software. His most recent game, Typing Land, came out in 2021. Smilebit, of course, would go on to create some exceptional sports games for Sega, as well as some beloved franchises like Jet Set Radio. Jet Set Radio itself even got a typing tutor for Japanese cell phones in 2006, but it's sadly not emulatable media at this point. Sega would resurrect the Typing of the Dead series with Typing of the Dead Overkill in 2013, and SSI TriStar and SourceNext would eventually take the rivalry to court, with SSI TriStar suing SourceNext for copyright infringement. While SSI TriStar would win that case, the costs eventually drove them out of business a couple years later, and SourceNext is still around. The occasional unusual typing packing still shows up, with a Pokemon game released for the Nintendo DS, but only in Europe and Japan. And even the cash-in still lives on, with Attack on Typing releasing in 2016. From typing software in magazines to unusual software packaged in books, to the beginnings of the indie community in the late 1990s, to experimentation towards the turn of the millennium in arcades and online, each of these games shows us a snapshot of the industry over time and gives us a sense of the creators that would work within them and sometimes outside of them as well. They give us a ton of insight into how games were played and perceived over the 40+ years of personal computing history. See you next time. Special thanks to Jeremiah Jones VO for lending his voice to the interview sections of this video. I will link his Instagram in the description. Additionally, this video took a little bit longer and required a little bit more research due to the obscurity of some of the titles talked about, so there's a couple of people to thank. First off, I'd like to thank Mr. Jakes of Basement Brothers for helping me figure out some of the PC-98 releases that came out in the early 1990s. Additionally, special thanks to Pasakan Diken and Lynn for Lynn's wonderful translation and Pasakan Diken's good playtesting of Sword of Kumdor. I would not have been able to complete that game without that work. As always, with this sort of thing, I'm not the only person that covers this topic, and there are some different videos that I uncovered that go over similar materials towards the end of my editing. The YouTuber DDMooogz has a quite differently styled look at a lot of the games mentioned in this video, as well as some I did not. And he has a 2-video series where he goes into his personal opinions, so if you're looking for a way more relaxed playstyle rather than my more historical perspectives, I'd recommend taking a look at those to get a sense of how the typing games play. Finally, the YouTuber Curious Arcade does a very similar video to mine that covers the idea of the Western rise of typing games, particularly in the United States. That video is woefully underseen, and it's incredible, so it's highly recommended. Special thanks to the users on the Patreon, including Matt Leffler, Andrew, and James B. As always, subscribing to the Patreon allows you certain access to extras, and for this one, it'll be playthroughs of some of the typing games with some more informal thoughts about them. Next up, we'll be taking a look at Relics, a very, very interesting Japanese series. But before that, there will be a short pause as I am moving to another area. Thank you all for your continued support, and I'll see you next time.